Yaakov, heel grabber. Second born, second best in the eyes of my father, who gave me nothing. From him I learned to take, to keep, to hold on. I spent my life fighting for what was mine, wrestling. Not with these, but with this. You have something I want. I would outsmart you. I would win. Ask my brother Esau. Birthright, mine. Ask my father Isaac. Blessing, mine. Ask my uncle Laban. Flocks, daughters, mine. Ask God. In second thought, ask me. I wrestled the Lord God there on the Yabok, in the darkness. There, he wounded me, crippled me, broke me. And that is how I won. Because when you fight God, winning does not mean breaking. Winning means being broken. There, it changed my name. I was Yaakov, heel grabber. But I became Israel. God fights. You cannot break God. He will break you. And then, only then, he will fight for you. Then you become the blessing to others that you were trying to steal from others.
Well, good morning, everybody. Hey, it's great to have you all with us today for our 11 o'clock service. And especially those of you online with us, we're so glad to have you tuning in today as well as we continue in our sermon series called Messy Life. And today is exciting because we are back together. Let me be one of the first ones to say welcome back home here to church. It's been a while. What has it been, like 10 weeks since we've been able to meet together? And we've been praying for you. We've been praying for this moment. And it's good to have some sort of normalcy, isn't it? And we're trying to get back into that. But we have been journeying through a sermon series called Messy Life. And you and I both know that life, if it's one thing it can be, it's messy. It can be messy. It's not always clean. We would like for it to be. But there are situations and circumstances that we find ourselves that just don't always go the way that maybe we thought. As we've looked at this whole sermon series, we are focusing on a man named Jacob. And we've detailed how his greatest struggle has been answering the question of who are you? Who are you? And maybe that's a question even here today and online we have to ponder. Who are you? Who are you really when you're by yourself, just thinking about it all alone? Now, last week, we left with Jacob in a place called Luz. Here he is exhausted, and he finds himself in the middle of nowhere, in complete darkness, laying his head on a rock, passing out. And I'm not surprised that he's exhausted, though. And you probably aren't either, because it is so tiresome trying to be someone that you're not. You expend a lot of energy trying to keep up with the game of who you're trying to be and trying to trick everybody into showing them that you have the life that you want them to see that you have. How many of us even here today are so exhausted from the game of just trying to present ourselves as perfect, but yet inside so flawed? If we are honest, we're all just a mess, tired of running. The reality of it is you were created to be you. You weren't created to be anybody else. You were created just to be you, not someone else. And the truth is that you think that being someone else will make you happy. That's why we always try to achieve more. We become jealous of people thinking that their lives are perfect, but we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And whenever you think that your happiness is by trying to be someone else, you will always be lost, and you will always find yourself running. Running from the fear of the truth, running from the hurt that you have caused, running from the hurt that has happened to you, just always running in a continuing state of running. We do this because it's so much easier to run away, isn't it, than face our own problems. So we take the road and we just try to run from everything. And I would say that until you face who you are, friends, you are always going to find yourself running, always trying to get away. But don't be surprised when you find yourself unable to outrun your own dysfunction. Because in my own life, I have found out that your dysfunction always has a way of catching up to you. You can never outrun it, because wherever you go, guess what? There you are. There you are. Always running will eventually lead you to a place that finds you completely alone. Always running will always find you and put you in a place to where you are alone in the middle of nowhere, looking for some glimmer of hope. You see, the reality of it is I bet that you never realized how messy not knowing your name could be. Who are you even here this morning? And how many of us are wrestling with the pain of not knowing what to say? Who am I? In Genesis 29, and we're going to be taking text today looking at Genesis chapter 29 and into Genesis 30 today. I'm going to be summarizing a lot of this, but you can follow along because you'll see where it is. And in Genesis 29, it starts off that we had just left him in a place called Luz, and he finds himself in a place now journeying to Padan Aram, looking for his uncle Laban, because right here is where his destination is. And in the distance, what we see in scriptures, it says that he sees a well. And he sees that this well has a large stone, and this stone is covering that well. And I think it's interesting that the scriptures describe this large stone that's covering this well. And the reason that I find that it's interesting is because a well is a source of fulfillment. The well is a source of fulfillment, and what ends up happening is you bring things that are empty to be filled. And right now, if you contrast the two, you have a well that is full of something, but yet you have Jacob, who is very empty right next to a well that can fill him. And one thing that I can tell you is that you have to be careful when you're running on empty. And I wonder how many of you here today are running on empty in your own lives, trying to find fulfillment in whatever it is that you think can fill you up. You see, when you're running empty, you can become blind to your own cravings. And before you realize it, you are waking up to something that you never intended to wake up to. You end up dropping your guard, and you are lying next to something that you didn't even want. The reality is, I wonder how frustrating it is when you are so close to a source that can fill you up, but yet you still leave empty. You still leave empty. And I bet that's the case here today. How many of you are coming in completely empty, feeling like life is void, and you have this source that even in here today is a source of the Holy Spirit that can fill you up, but yet here you are, and what a tragedy it'll be if you have the source to be filled and leave out of here filled up, but yet you leave empty. Because the truth is, being filled is a choice. You get to choose all of your life what you fill yourself up on. But be careful of the empty moments, because you could end up filling yourself up with something that gives you nothing in the end. Jacob encounters some shepherds and he asks them a question. He's asking them, where are they from? Now, the reason he's asking this question is because he's trying to figure out if he's close to where his uncle is from, Laban. And the shepherds state that they are from a place called Haran. And it says here, now, this also piques Jacob's interest when he hears about this, because he knows that that's where his uncle Laban is from. And so he's feeling like he's close by. And he essentially asks them, well, can you tell me how Laban's doing? How is he? He goes into full interrogation mode, trying to figure out where and how his uncle is doing. Because at this point, we don't even know if he's ever seen him at this moment. And they are telling him, and as they're exchanging pleasantries, all of a sudden it tells us that off in the distance they say, here comes his daughter Rachel, coming off in the distance. You know what Jacob does? Jacob calls out his inner Samson and goes over to this large stone that's covering. Now, these stones during these days were extremely heavy, right? It would sometimes take 2 to 3 people, if not more, to lift the stone up there, because what would happen is the shepherds would bring all of their flocks over, so that way that they could all allow them to draw water and get water at the same time. That way you weren't moving this thing all the time. They would spend it one day. But here is Jacob trying to impress not only Rachel, but also her father, right? So it can get back word of him that he is here. And so what does he do? He removes the entire rock all by himself and moves it and sets it aside. Interesting thing here is, isn't it easier sometimes to move something like that, but you can't move the rock that's covering your own life? Isn't that so frustrating sometimes? That you can have the strength to do some things, but you don't have enough strength to get you out of the mess that's in your life. And that's Jacob, where he's at right now. Here he is, he's able to lift it, and in a matter of moments, Jacob goes from ultra macho man to a little sissy, kissing Rachel and weeping, right? That's where it is. He's weeping out loud. And can I be honest with you? As I looked at this, I wondered, here's this guy that just lifted this huge stone off of this well. What is he crying about? Did he get hurt? Like, what's going on? And it's not that at all. Like, I simply wanted to know, like, why is he weeping? Because it confused me. And the reason I think he's weeping is because he sees a glimmer of hope. You see, when you're near hope, all of a sudden you get excited by it. You see, right now, if we look at Jacob's life, what does he have going for him? He's running away from a situation that he has created. He has literally nothing. He has no possessions in his hand. Here he is. It tells us that he has the blessing and the birthright, but he's left with nothing. What good is the blessing and the birthright when you don't have anything? A blessing, like I said last week, this looks like more like a curse. Here he has nothing. He has no money. He has no home. He has no family. And what I find about this is that it's so true that you can outrun your location. You can outrun where you're from. You can try to outrun the mess that you've created, but you can't outrun your pain. Your pain will show up in the most unusual places. You could be having the time of your life, and that pain can hit you. Someone could say something just the right way, and all of a sudden, before you know it, you're weeping tears. You could be in the middle of church service, having an amazing time, and something hits you, and the pain catches up with you right where you're at. It can catch up to you when you least expect it. Jacob is weeping because he won't have to be alone anymore. You know what most of us fear? Being alone. Now, we can do it for a little bit, but when people leave us completely alone, we put that towards our value, and we feel like people that want to leave us alone, want nothing to do with it. And it's very hard when you've been left alone and overlooked your entire life to ever feel like you matter or that you value. And I wonder how many people here today within the sound of my voice feel that way sometimes. Here is Jacob. He has arrived at his destination that should shelter him from his pain, but ironically, he finds that the pain is just as real and just as hurtful as he is here, where he tried to escape it, as he was back in his parents' house. Because pain has a way of traveling, and it doesn't matter how fast you run, it'll always catch up. And so, after this happens, he moves the rock off. He weeps, he kisses Rachel, he embraces Rachel, and Rachel's excited because she sees that her cousin is around, and all of a sudden Rachel runs and tells her father, Laban, about this situation, and Laban, it says, runs out to meet Jacob, and you'll see this in Genesis 29. I want to point out verses 13 and 14, and look at what it says. As soon as Laban heard that his nephew Jacob had arrived, he ran out to meet him. He runs out, he wants to meet him, and it says he embraced and kissed him and brought him home. To Jacob, this looks like family. This is everything he wants because he's destroyed his family. It looks good. He wants this. And when Jacob had told him his story, look at this. When Jacob had told him his story, Laban exclaimed, "You really are my own flesh and blood," where his uncle Laban lives. It's an interesting exchange, isn't it? Here's this guy they both have never met. Laban embraces him. He kisses him. It's a nice, cordial moment. Pleasantries are being exchanged. And I just got to tell you something in your life. When you're running empty, when you're running hurt and wounded, be careful who you embrace. Be careful who it is that you embrace. This is especially true when you're both wounded and empty. Because Laban embraces Jacob. We see that, and it's the moment that Jacob wants. It's the moment that Jacob lives for, because the night before he was all alone in the middle of nowhere, just hoping and praying that his life would amount to more than in the situation that he's in. And this can be dangerous because not everyone, listen to me, not everyone who embraces you has your best interest at heart. I would love to tell you that they do, but listen to me, they don't. There are some people that just because they're good to you, it doesn't mean that they're good for you. And a lot of our struggle is trying to tell the difference because they don't come with a warning sign. Sometimes the most devastating thing is when they come as family. How many of us have been destroyed by the idea a family that have the open embrace, but the whole time are stabbing you in the back? How many of us have had situations just like this? Because sometimes when you are thirsty for someone to love you, you will take it no matter how it looks. You will take it no matter how it looks. This is why I say walking empty is so dangerous, because it creates blind spots in your own discernment towards other people. And what ends up happening is you end up embracing things that have the ability to absolutely enslave you. I wonder how many of us have given in to things we wish we never would have, thinking that they would bring us some sort of satisfaction, some sort of sense of love and belonging and maybe identity, only to find ourselves enslaved to something that actually makes us question our identity even further. It happens to the best of us. Now, in this, we see that Jacob has been staying with Laban. The scene shifts to him now being there for almost a month while he's been living with Laban. And Laban comes to him and he says, "Listen, you shouldn't be working for me for completely free. Name your price. Name your price. What should your wages be?" Here's the interesting thing about that. Because you will always end up naming your own price for your own identity sometimes. What's the price you're willing to pay to figure out who you are? What's the price you're willing to pay to understand who loves you? What's the price that you're willing to pay to sometimes even get your identity back? You see, Jacob, even though Laban is asking him about the price of the wages, it's really more than that, because what Jacob wants is companionship. What Jacob wants is to no longer feel like he's just here and he has nowhere and he has nothing and he has no possessions. Laban demands Jacob to tell him how much his wages should be. Sometimes we don't realize it, friends, but there is always a price that we are seemingly ready to pay for love, isn't there? And this is where the story gets so messy. It's where your story probably gets very messy in trying to get someone to love you, trying to find your own identity, trying to do something and be something that maybe you're not, just trying to verify who you are. And so you do everything, because a lot of times when we don't know who we are, we try to go to other people so that way they can tell us who we are. And because we place all of our marbles in their opinion of us, it wrecks us so many times. Name your price. Name your price. Then you've got to ask, is it worth it? It's where it gets messy. And it shouldn't really surprise us in the story, because the whole story has been a mess. Jacob's entire life has been one of just messiness, one mess after the other, because love in and of itself is very much a mess. The writer of Genesis tells us something interesting when we get to Laban's daughters, and I want you to remember this. In Genesis 29, and we're going to be looking at 16 and 17, those verses, I want you to pinpoint what is saying here about Laban's daughters. And it says in 16, now Laban had two daughters, right? He had an oldest daughter, and then he had a younger daughter. The older daughter was named Leah, and the younger one was Rachel. And look at 17, it says this about Leah. There was no sparkle in Leah's eye, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. How's that sound to you guys? You get what it's saying? Now, this statement has been debated by many scholars of what does it mean that she had no sparkle in her eyes. Some of your translation may even say that she had weak eyes. Essentially, if we cut through it all, it means she was a butterface. That was the New World edition of that. But basically, it was sort of like the equivalent of saying she had a really nice personality. She's really friendly. No, seriously, she's great. She's awesome, right? It was the equivalent of what they were trying to say. And no matter how you put it, it doesn't sound good. In verse 18, really it tells us all we need to know about it is it contrasts both of them. Rachel is the one that everybody looked at and thought, she looks so good. That's who they wanted. That's who they desired. Where Leah was not pleasing to the eye. She had weak eyes. She didn't have a sparkle in her eyes. In 18, it says, since Jacob was in love with Rachel, he told her father, I'll work for you for 7 years if you'll just give me Rachel. Jacob loves Rachel just like I love Rachel. Right? And look at this. He says, give me your younger daughter Rachel as my wife. And Laban agrees. And so goes the 7 years of tribulation, of blissful love. But verse 20 gives us maybe one of the most romantic statements in all the Bible. Guys, take note, okay? You ready for this? Look at this. Here he is. He's getting ready to work 7 years. He gets done with 7 years, and it says this, but his love for her was so strong that it seemed to him but a few days. Oh, that's just heartwarming, right? Most of us are just thinking like, yep, sure it was, Jacob. Sure it was. 7 years seeming like only a few days. Jacob has completed his contract. 7 years has passed. He goes to Laban and he says, "Now give me my wife." Because after all, it only seemed like a few days. And Laban, you know what he does? He throws the party of all parties. He sets this marriage feast on fire. This thing is lit. It is out of control. He's invited everybody to the party to see him give his daughter away to Jacob, right? Everything looks great. Jacob is finally free, right? Isn't that what we're all looking for? Is a sense of being free from the burden of trying to figure out who we are. He is no longer going to be alone for the rest of his life. He now has a family, and he is marrying the love of his life. And he is beginning to feel like he knows exactly who he is. Everything is perfect. Well, that is until he wakes up. Have you ever had moments like that? To where everything is perfect until you wake up? It felt like such a dream until you get up and you realize that it's a nightmare. Sometimes life can feel that way. You see, what's interesting to me is that mourning can change everything in an instant, can it? It can change some bad things into good, and it can highlight some of the decisions you made in the night that you didn't realize what you're doing in the morning. A light always has a way of bringing kind of light into the darkness of what happened last night. I love the almost comedic nature that Scripture sets to this situation, right? You can almost see Jacob waking up. He's had the time of his life. He's rolling over to bed and he sees his wife next to him, her back to him. He goes to reach out for her. And all of a sudden she turns around. And this is what Scripture says. It's Leah! As if like there's this big surprise. And it is, because he thought he married Rachel. Right? He thought he had married Rachel. He thought he got the one. He worked 7 years for Rachel. But he woke up in the morning and it wasn't what he thought. It's so confusing when what you wanted doesn't happen. It's so confusing when you wanted one thing but ended up getting another. But the truth is, by now, Jacob should be used to this because it's been his entire life. He's wanted one thing but got the other. But I wonder if it tastes familiar to Jacob. I wonder if it has a certain taste to it. Because I'm sure he knows what it feels like. I'm sure he knows what it tastes like. You see, we actually see Jacob getting a taste of his own medicine. We see Jacob getting a taste of his own medicine. There is this almost soul-crushing question that in the midst of Jacob tasting his own medicine, that he asks a question and he says, "What have you done to me? What have you done to me? Laban, why have you done this? Do you not understand how hard it is to just find my identity, and now you've done this? Who am I now? I thought I had everything together, but you've ripped it apart. What have you done to me, Laban?" It's here that I started thinking about the hypocrisy of that question coming from Jacob. What do you mean? What has happened to you, Jacob? Are you seriously asking that question? Well, Jacob, it's the same thing you did to your brother Esau. It's the exact same thing. It looks the exact same way. Well, you don't like it? You don't like the way that it tastes? You see, I took something that you wanted, and what I did is I left you with a bowl of lentil soup. What? You don't like the soup? You don't like the way that it feels, Jacob? You see, it's so dangerous to be led by your emotions. It is so dangerous to be led by your emotions. And most of us, we have not learned how to control our emotions. What has happened is our emotions control us. Because you can be so enamored with the feeling of love that you never quite realize the danger involved in love. Because there's two sides of the same coin, because I can guarantee you this, that love comes with risk, and there are great moments to it, but there are also some painful moments in experiencing this thing that we all try to achieve in love. And whenever you try to be someone else, you will always wake up to a Leah. Getting something, receiving something you didn't even want in the first place. That if you just would have been aware of what was going on, you could have stopped it. But because you were intoxicated with the greed of what you wanted, someone tricked you. And now you're going to spend the rest of your life in a mess. And what Jacob believes is going to be a period to this chapter of his life becomes actually a semicolon. As Laban tells him the custom of having to give away the oldest daughter first. I bet this sounds just like deja vu to Jacob. He can't get away from this birthright thing, can he? No matter how he tries to play it, he is still getting stopped by this custom of giving away to the first person, the firstborn. Yet he is experiencing it again. Fighting the same thing that he has always fought, the identity of the older sibling. And it's almost like the writer of Genesis wants us to catch something about sowing and reaping. It's almost like the writer of Genesis wants us to see the nature of sowing and reaping in this event. Because what I do know is that whatever you sow, you'll always reap. Whatever you sow, you will always reap. Now, this may not happen right away. It barely ever does. But rest assured, it eventually catches up to you. And a lot of times when you least expect it, a lot of times when you feel like your life is about to turn its corner and go up, all of a sudden you're faced with you, which is confusing. Because after all, isn't that who you were trying to outrun? How did it catch up to you when you thought you had left it in the dust? And here it is, and you're face to face with a similar situation, but you're on the receiving end of it, going, wait, what? I thought I outran this thing. It's a bitter taste as Jacob ends up having to work 7 more years for something he thought he already had. Which is interesting. It's interesting because in the same vein, I wonder how that left Leah feeling. Because they're both feeling the same thing. Think about Leah. Her whole life she'd wanted a husband, and now she has one. She was just a pawn in it all. She too wakes up turning over thinking that her life is going to be completely different, only to see the shocked look of a husband that wants nothing to do with her. She's looked for the same thing, wanted the same thing, and here she is, just like Jacob, trying to discover who she is. What's your name, Leah? Because you'll see here that she will take on the countenance of someone that is very unloved. In fact, Scripture for the next couple chapters keeps telling us how she feels about these things. Verse 30 actually tells us this. In Genesis 29, verse 30, it says that Jacob loved Rachel so much more than Leah. And as I read this week, I couldn't help but feel for Leah. She is someone wanting to be loved, but she just isn't, no matter what she can do. And I think that we have all felt the sting of that reality, wanting to be seen, wanting to be loved, and no matter what we do, it doesn't change that person into loving us. It is a pain that we don't want to feel, but it's a pain so many of us know all too well. It is such a sting. She is someone in a marriage that is unseen. She is tolerated, but not loved. I would rather be loved than tolerated. And this is where she's at. The happiest day of her life turns into a nightmare too. It's such a mess. Which, it shows you the jerk nature of Jacob, doesn't it? That you think out of everybody, he would understand this situation. because he knows how it feels to try to get the attention of someone that doesn't love him the same? I mean, you could argue that the whole reason he's trying to get the birthright is because he wants his father's attention. His father's always giving it to old Esau. Here's Leah, and the same thing, and he's being the same issue that he experienced. But that is the problem with being wounded, isn't it? That you only care about your own wounds, and very rarely the wounds of other people. As long as I get mine taken care of, I'm okay. You figure your own out. Sometimes we can be such a selfish bunch, can't we? A world burns, but as long as my wounds are cared for and tended to, it's okay. People are hurting every single day, but as long as my wounds are taken care of, it's okay. We can tend to only care about our own wounds, so you tend to see people for what they can do for you and how they can help you achieve healing in your life. And as long as I get mine, I'm all good. Honestly, how many of us could bring such healing to people, but because of our own dysfunction, all we end up doing is hurting people that we could have helped heal, but because we're so wounded, we don't even know how to heal ourselves, so we can't bring healing to other people. But I get it. Because it's hard to bring healing to others when you can't bring healing to yourself. And so what we see is Leah, just like Jacob, is left completely alone, loved only by custom. And now I want to take some time because I want to speak to some Leahs here today. I want to speak to some Leahs here today, and I'm not just talking about women. I'm talking about men, I'm talking about boys, I'm talking to girls, and anyone that has been rejected by people and are desperately wanting to be loved for who they are and not just for what they can produce or do. I want to talk to you for a second, because I know that online and in this place here today, that there are some of you who are wrestling with your identity after you've watched your father walk out on your entire family. I know that there are some women who are picking up the pieces of a broken heart after finding out that their spouse cheated on them. You see, I know that there are teens struggling with sitting alone during lunch who smile around everybody else and act like it's all right, but they go to their bed at night and they cry themselves to sleep. I know that there are people that are living in the trap of believing that achieving more of something will cause someone to love you more. We can easily live in this next mentality of what comes next will make it better. If I just do more, the next time they'll love me more. And some of us have chosen to live with a next mentality, believing that the next man or the next woman or the next job will bring me satisfaction. But we rarely find that it ever does. Sure, it may last for a moment, but once the newness wears off, you realize that it was only an exchange for services rendered. And there's nothing worse than only being loved because you had to be loved, not because you truly were loved. But next can be so overrated when you tie your happiness to it, friends. Because you never truly know satisfaction. You're always trying to put your marbles in the basket of joy, happiness, peace, contentment, and love. Leah is putting all of her identity in a man that doesn't even know who he is. Why would you do that, Leah? Why are so many of us putting our hopes and our emotions and our love and our identity in the hands of people that don't even love themselves? When you can't love yourself, you can't love anybody else hardly. Some of us are ripped apart because we're giving our identities to someone that if you would ask them, well, who are you? They couldn't even answer anyway. You see, That's why you have to be wise, not to be so empty that you allow people that have no business in filling you up. Because a lot of times, their emptiness will try to pour into your emptiness. You've got to be careful in these moments. Leah is putting all of her identity in a man that doesn't even know who he is. And that is what a lot of us do every single day. Worrying about getting love from someone that doesn't even love themselves half the time. Leah is living miserably because her identity is wrapped up solely on making Jacob love her. Heartbreakingly, you see this when she births him a child, and this is what she says. The Lord has noticed my misery, and now my husband will love me. Oh man, that breaks my heart. That breaks my heart because I know within the sound of my voice there are people that feel the same way. Now that I did this, now that I achieved this, certainly Dad will love me. Now that I did this, Mom will give me the affirmation that I need. Now that I'm on the team, now my friends they'll want to be around me. And how many of us are living in that reality and that rawness, and yet we still do not feel satisfied with it. We still don't know who we are, and we still try to find people that'll just accept us and love us. It can be so challenging, can't it? The Lord has noticed my misery, and my husband will love me. And she's saying this because she's able to give him children, and she thinks because she can give him children that'll all of a sudden make him love her more. But I got to tell you, Leah, it doesn't work that way. I wish it did. I wish we all thought it would work that way, that the more that I can do, I can will you to love me. And isn't that the toughest thing? That I can't make anybody love me. No matter how hard I try. And how much of our brokenness is from that fact. Listen, it is dangerous to your soul to try to earn love based off what you can provide to someone. Because the problem is, what happens when you can no longer produce it? Then you realize what the love really was. It wasn't because of you. You know what we all want? You know what we all strive and what we all want? We want someone to love us for us. With all the mess, with all the flaws, with all the hurts, with all the pimples, all the junk that we have, we want them to love us as advertised. And why is it so difficult to find that? A lot of times I think it's because we don't love ourselves. If love is based on what you achieve, is it even love? In the end, there may be moments to where it actually feels great, but it always leaves you feeling empty. But I got to tell you something, Leah. Jacob may not love you. Other people may not love you. They may not see your value. They may say certain things behind your back as if you've got weak eyes. They may say certain things that you don't look like this. You shouldn't have this. They may label you a certain thing. But even though Jacob doesn't love you and Jacob doesn't see you, God sees you. God loves you. He's doing something in the midst of your pain. And can I tell you something? Sometimes pain becomes the greatest motivator to set a captive free. I know that you don't feel it, Leah. I know that it hurts. I know that it stings. But God is working on your behalf. God sees you. Don't you dare give up, because God sees you. Now, I wouldn't be fair if I didn't talk to some Rachels here. I got to talk to some Rachels here. You are the people who can easily be overlooked simply because of the way that your life looks. You see, your life, it looks good. Maybe even you look good, and people can assume that there is nothing that you're in need of. That there's nothing that you're in need of, but they are sorely mistaken, because underneath the facade is something that is barren inside, something that is very unfruitful. Even though it looks to the outside that you have it all, you may have the material things that you need, but inside you're missing something. And it can be very frustrating. People can assume that there is nothing that you're in need of, and with that comes a lot of frustration because your life can look so perfect from the outside, but behind the scenes, it is very barren. How can it be that you can have a lot of people near you, but still feel empty? How can it be that you can have a lot of friends, but still say you don't feel like you have any? How can it be that you have everything you've ever wanted and still feel empty? Because you can possess a lot of things and not possess the one thing that you actually need. You're always trying to prove your worth when everybody else thinks that you've already achieved it. One of the greatest lies is that people that put on the smile and have it looking like they're all together actually all together. Because so many times, there's a ton of skeletons in that closet fighting for who they are. Sometimes the worst things is to actually be a Rachel, to be overlooked as if they have no problems, but deep down inside, they're rotting away with the best of them. But the whole time, they'll have a smile up, making you think it all looks good. And your frustration comes in what you can't produce. If people only knew the hurt and frustration that boils underneath the surface, they would realize that beauty only goes so deep. But really, that's the problem with proximity, isn't it? The further away you are, you don't really know and see it up close. You've learned to show people what you want them to see. It's interesting today with all of the social media because we can all pick the picture of the life that we want to produce and show in front of everybody. We can have the best vacations. We can have our kids all smiling. We can delete the ones of where it's just a chaos and mess, right? We don't want anybody to see that. We don't want to put up the things to where me and my wife are arguing the entire time. We want to put it to where it looks like we never argue at all. And so you can put up a picture-perfect life, but inside, behind the photos, there's stories that aren't being told. We are raising generations of both Leah and Rachel. People that feel so unloved, and people that only think that they receive love by likes and comments. What a danger we are creating when you get your self-worth off someone just that you don't even know, hitting a like button. You are created with much more value than that. So much more value than that. We have learned how to get people to like what we look like, but who never actually know us. It looks like they have it all except for loving themselves. You see, Leah and Rachel both do the exact same thing, trying to prove their worth, trying to make sure that they are loved, having more and more children to make Jacob love them. And there's this crazy story in Genesis 30, and they go back and forth with having children. They're trying to manipulate their own future. They're trying to prove their worth. They're trying to make sure that Jacob loves them supremely and just solely them. They send maidservants to them, and he has children with the maidservants. Altogether, there are 12 children that are birthed to Jacob. He's got a ton of children. But still, 2 people feel like they're not loved. How can you produce so much and still not have verification of who you are to them? How is it possible that after that long, both Leah and Rachel still don't know who they are? I wonder if that's where some of you are today. Who am I? This is creating such a mess in this situation. But we all know that life is a mess. And right here is where God chooses to do His best work in the mess of situations that we don't see any good that can come out of it. You see a mess, but I guarantee you that God sees a message. While they see a crazy family situation that has two sisters fighting for love, what we see is God that sees a nation being born in both of them, because God doesn't work the same way as you and I do. No, God works beneath the scenes. God works beneath the brokenness. God works beneath the pain, and He puts it all together to create a greater purpose for His cause. You see, you see it as just a mess, but He sees it as building a kingdom. He sees purpose in the struggle. He finds value in the mess. He shows up in the middle of nowhere. He meets you at the well. He meets you in your emptiness. He sees you when no one else does. And despite it all, God uses every bit of it. God uses it all for His glory. Now I have to go back, though, because I was reading this. I had to go back and look at Leah, her story, for a second time to cap this off. Because I think that is where so many of us are. We are all like Leahs. Because we feel the sting of not being loved. We're going around trying to prove to people that we're worthy of being loved. We feel so unloved ourselves. I want you to know today that God sees you. God loves you, and it said in 31 that when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, when God saw that Leah was unloved, He enabled her to have children. I don't know about you, but I am thankful for a God that sees the unloved. I'm thankful for a God that moves in when someone feels all alone. I'm thankful for a God that meets me in the middle of nowhere and lets me know that when I feel like I have no future, that I have a future. I'm thankful for a God that shows up in the middle of the night and lets me know that there can still be hope. I'm glad that I have a God that enters into my mess and lets me know that it's not too messy for Him. That redemption can be experienced wherever I am, whether it be in the middle of nowhere, whether it be in the dark, whether it be in a complete mess that I have made myself. God is there. Maybe you feel like Leah today, wondering what good can come out of this situation that you are in. It's such a mess. But I have to tell you that God has purpose in everything. I want to point your attention to what Matthew 1 says in verse 1 and 2. When I looked at this, it spoke to me because I think someone needs to hear this today. That it says in Matthew 1:1, this is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. And in 2 it says, Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. And at surface, it looks just like a genealogy, and you're probably sitting there going, okay, who really cares? A genealogy. You missed it. Because maybe you're thinking about your own mess. You missed it because sometimes when you're only looking on the surface, you miss what's happening underneath. You see, we've just got done describing the whole mess that these women are in. Leah feels unloved, and in the moment she can, but you have to understand that God doesn't play the short game, He plays the long game. God does something that you don't see, and that's what I'm trying to prove, is that sometimes you don't see it because it's not meant for you to see. But what I want to tell you is that God is always moving on your behalf, whether you realize it or not. And that is true even here today. You see, what we're seeing is that the lineage came through Leah. Did you see that? It says that Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. You see, what they're telling you is that the lineage of Jesus comes through Leah. God loved Leah. Even though Jacob didn't love Leah, God did love Leah. God saw Leah. God saw her in her brokenness. God saw her in her need and her desperation. And He said, Jacob may not love you, but I love you. And I know you may not feel loved, but I'm going to show you how much I love, that the Savior of the world is going to birth through you. And in Him, He's going to give love to everybody. He knows what it feels like to be in your shoes, Leah. And so when you feel like God is deaf to your cries, when you feel like you keep searching for love and it's never there, I want you to go back to the story and know that Leah felt it too. And for all of you Leahs there that feel like, man, I just want someone to love me for me, that if God can do that for Leah, He can do it for you. Why? Because He loves you and He sees you, and even though it feels like a mess, He is doing something in you. Nelson, can I have you come? The lineage of the Savior of the world was birthed through a mess. I bet you didn't realize that hope could come through a mess, did you? Sometimes the greatest demonstration of love is shown in a mess. So don't you dare give up today. Don't you dare lose heart. Don't you dare feel like you are unloved or you are unseen. Don't you dare feel like what people have said about you has become your identity. What you need to know is that God and only God is working on your behalf. He sees you, He loves you, and He is doing something. In the end, He will use it all. He will use the pain. He will use the frustration. He will use the searching. He will use the mess, all for His glory. Because like I said before, you see it as a problem, but He sees it as a promise. That He is going to identify you, and you're going to know who you are through Him. The problem a lot of us have is that we're going to the wrong source to be filled. Don't leave here empty. Leave here filled up knowing who you are in Him. Because why would you go to anyone else besides the person that made you? Scripture tells me that He knows the number of hairs upon your head. I don't even know that on Rachel. What that tells me is that my God knows her far better than I do. So she should never get her value from me. She could get it from the God that created her. And it's the same thing to you. I know there has been words that both online and even here today that you have walked with for the rest of your life. They have become your clothes. Those hurtful things that you have taken as your identity, you need to take them off, because that's not who you are. Quit walking wounded and walk alive today.